Chag Sameach. I'm going to try to warm you up with some words of Torah as best as I can. The other way to warm you up is just by taking your hands and rubbing them together really quickly. If that doesn't work, you can try jumping jacks. All right, well, doing my best here. It is wonderful to be together, even in this brisk morning, and hopefully next Sunday for the final day of Pesach, we'll be together with warmer weather. As my family was preparing for Pesach, we decided to have some outdoor meals because it's a little easier, because it was beautiful this week, and it's a little easier to deal with the Pesach Hametz situation. And one night, we started discussing a little bit about the historicity of Pesach and the events in the Torah. And Matan said to me, Abba, what do you think? Did this really happen? And we went through some of the normal attempts to reconcile history and reality with what it narrates in the Torah. And so we talked a little bit about the idea that there may have been an island in the Mediterranean, a volcanic island, the island of Santorini that exploded, which would have explained many of the plagues, although not quite in the same order. Then we went into the fact that there were 600,000 men over the age of 20. That would be a problem because that would mean about 2 million people. It's not so easy to move 2 million people through the wilderness for 40 years. That was a problem. We went with the normal answer. It says Shishim Ribua in one of the places in the Torah. So a Ribua, instead of meaning 10,000, could have meant a phalanx, a small unit of soldiers, 5 soldiers, 60 times 5, 300, plus women, children, 1,000. That seemed more realistic. But of course, for 40 years of wandering through the desert, still tough to imagine. And so we were struggling. Now, of course, many people would say the Torah isn't trying to present history. The Torah is meta-history. It is really narrating an experience or experiences that may have happened in some form, but it's not trying to actually tell you what happened. And if we look at human studies and intellectual ideas in general, human beings haven't always wanted to represent history, what actually happened. It's more about an interpretation of what may or may not have happened. It's much more in the story. But many of our young people struggle with this. And we often, Rabbi Kling-Perkins and I, Mayor, other teachers in our school and our community are given this question, but what in fact happened? And how do we understand and reconcile the narratives of the Torah with what we understand as modern Jews? And if we're going to pass this on to our children, how can it make any sense to them? And so there's really a larger meta question that stands here, which is, if the history didn't happen as it's presented in the Torah, whether entirely at all, or at least not in the way it's represented, what does that mean for us as modern Jews? What does it mean for how we transmit this to our children or grandchildren or students or future generations? And so I think it's important for us to come up and to present a theology that makes some sense, one that can resonate with us and that we can actually pass down. So of course, it's also important to note how these stories came into being and to teach them properly, that we have poems and songs and texts that weren't first written down, but of course were originally probably sung. Why were they sung? Easy to remember, right? What a gift it is for us to sing together, finally, after a long time. because you don't even need your Siddur if you just keep singing. You just know it. And that process went on in ancient times. So we think some of the most early parts of our Torah are the songs, like Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea, that we'll sing and read next Shabbat. Right, so those are the earliest layers. And those songs get passed down, and then narratives get attached to the songs, and after hundreds and hundreds of years, they're written into texts, probably different versions, and then they're woven together by anonymous editors, copied, recopied, until we get some of our earliest texts. So that's one. The second thing that I was talking about with Matan is, but let's say none of this occurred. I think it was Rabbi David Wolpe who wrote an article, I forgot when it was, 15, 20 years ago, that said none of this happened. Nothing. No Exodus, not even 1,000 people. I'll present it to you this way. Let's say you had a video camera, and I'm very grateful to Pi, who is making this service a reality, and they brought several video cameras. Let's say they had all of their video cameras pointing at the place where the Exodus could have taken place, any of those places. And they were just rolling. They had a lot of digital space, unlimited memory. These cameras were just rolling for hundreds of years. And they could prove definitively that there was no Exodus. Matan then interrupted me at this point and said, well, you could just doctor the filming and you could do anything you want. But that notwithstanding, let's say you prove definitively no Exodus. I remember having this conversation with an Orthodox friend of mine. So I told you there was no Exodus. This was a friend of mine named Ariel. And I said, Ariel, if no Exodus, what would you do? He said, well, I'd immediately go out and get a double bacon cheeseburger. I said, really? He said, yeah. No Exodus, no Torah, no mitzvahs. I'm going out right now. You coming? I said, that's so interesting. For me, it wouldn't make one difference. There's absolutely nothing that I would change in my life. Not one pattern, not one mitzvah. I'd definitely be more inclined to have mustard during Pesach, but that's a side point. That's just a little disagreement in my own house. But there's not one law or one observance that I would change. Because for me, the Torah exists, and the sanctity of the Torah is not in the fact of its representing some actual historical events that happened the way it's narrating. For me, the sanctity of the Torah is in all of us sitting here, slightly shivering, and for you at home, probably a little warmer. We're not going to be jealous. And it's the fact that we have read this text every year for thousands of years. And that we ourselves have created the holiness. And I don't need a videotape. I don't need an archaeological dig. I don't need an independent other text to back it up. Because I know that we've been telling these stories for thousands of years. That we have the history. That we know from our own texts, from rabbinic texts. We know that also from Christian texts. We know it from sources like Josephus. Those texts we know. And even if I didn't go all the way back that far, we have those stories in our own families. We have it in our own lives. We create those moments. And the sanctity comes from ourselves. And going back, whatever generations we go back. If you're a Jew by choice, then you yourself have created that sanctity. And that's summed up in the most important line of the Haggadah. really the thesis that the whole Haggadah is building towards. The words of Rabbi Gamliel. We have 4 tellings in the Magid section, just to remind you of the structure. Sometimes you get lost in the food and the fact that you're hungry. But there's 4 tellings. Each one has question, answer, and then a song of praise. The first one, you know, Manishtana, Avadim Ayinu. Then we sing a song, Vihi Shamda. Am I getting it wrong? Is that Baruch HaMakom? I think that's Vihi Shamda. I don't have the Haggadah in front of me. Then it goes through a second one, a third one, the fourth one. The fourth one is the key. Rabban Gamliel just says it so simply. You got to say 3 things at the Seder. Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. That's it. Obviously, originally, this was a very tasty stop at a shawarma stand. Right? Because the original matzah was Eish Tanor bread, which some of us are trying to make. I understand David made it. I'm going to try myself, thanks to Scott's flour from Rabbi Dollinger over in Providence. I'm going to try to make some this afternoon, have it at the second Seder. It was a soft bread. They had the Pesach, the lamb. Imagine that nicely sliced. The maror was a nice chimichurri sauce. They rolled that whole thing up, and they ate it. I don't know what we're doing with Hillel sandwich, with all due respect. That's just a wacky sandwich. No one in their right mind would make that as a sandwich. Anyway, thought the fluffernutter was weird. Anyway, right, then after that he says, the key line of the whole Seder, and you should stop at that line and really take it in. Bechol dor vador, chayav adam lirot et atzmo ki ilu hu yatsa mimitzrayim. In every generation, we should see ourselves, I'll make it into plural like the Debbie Friedman version. We should see ourselves as if we went out from Egypt. Right? That we're supposed to see this as an experience that transcends time. I'll offer you how the Hasidic tradition says it so beautifully. What does this mean? The Sfat Emet, the Ger Rebbe, writing in Warsaw about 125 years ago, it says that we must identify with the experiences of our ancestors, but more importantly, it means that today, if we find ourselves in exile in any aspect from ourselves, we must maintain always an inner sense of being free. He gives us a beautiful psychological reading. And then the Me'or Einayim, another Hasidic master, says, when Israel was in Egypt, our awareness was in exile. We weren't able to really see the wonder and the beauty of the world. He has an amazing analogy. Just as a shell covers the fruit, so was our consciousness covered with a shell that was like a walnut. This is good because you're thinking of making charoset. There is a hard outer shell to the walnut, but underneath there is also a finer inner shell encasing the fruit. In leaving Egypt, the hard outer shell was cracked open. This allowed the Israelites to see the fruit, but also the fine inner shell that still remained. When our inner essence will be completely revealed in a messianic future time, of greater wakefulness will come. The Me'or Einayim says, yes, we cracked open that outer shield, that outer shell, when we left Egypt. The paradigm of redemption. That becomes this meta idea, whether it happened or not. It's in the telling of a moment of freedom that has inspired us, that inspired black slaves 200 years ago, that inspired people living around the planet to imagine a better world. But it's not a perfect world. You got to then get into that inner shell and see that we have work to do. We're supposed to see ourselves as if we're leaving Egypt. Therefore, we identify with those who suffer, and we work like hopefully no one else does to make this a better world. So the teaching It doesn't really matter if we were literally slaves or not. It really doesn't matter if the events happened or not. It doesn't matter if you show me the videotape. Well, there's no videotape anymore. Whatever there is now, chips of video. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we identify with a narrative and a story that's transformational. And that we can teach ourselves and future generations that what's really important is that we identify with those who suffer. Because everyone suffers on some level. Being broken is essential to being a human being. And if we reach out to ourselves and to others and respond to that suffering, as God does when God breaks into the narrative right before the burning bush, because God hears the suffering, that is the model of what it means to be a human being, certainly what it means to be a Jew, and certainly the way we should act. So, for me, there's something so much deeper than any historical event. There is, in fact, the teachings of our Torah, which transcend time, which transcends history, and there's something that we can actually bequeath to ourselves, to our children, to future generations. And maybe that's why it lasts so powerfully. So when you're telling the story tonight at the second Seder, you know that you are tying into something that is so much deeper than any aspect of history. It speaks to a deeper truth, to a truth about how we've tried to respond to this world around us, how we try to respond to other people, and how we actually work in this world. And that history is the truest history of them all. Chag Sameach.